In the rugged backcountry of Riverstone, Montana, an unstoppable force is about to collide with an immovable object. When the feared Los Águilas Cartel sets their sights on Silver Pine Ranch, assuming it's just another tired property owned by a quiet horse trainer, they have no idea they've just stepped into the lion's den. Because Victoria Sullivan isn't just any rancher. She's a former military operative who once led specialized canine missions in the most hostile war zones on Earth. And her dogs aren't the kind you pat on the head and feed scraps. They're wolf dogs trained to hunt in the deadliest conditions imaginable. This isn't another simple turf war. It's a battle of predator versus predator. As the cartel's northern expansion collides with a woman who never truly left the battlefield, the mountains of Montana will echo with a new kind of warfare. The men who thought they'd scare her off with guns and threats are about to discover that this ex-soldier and her lethal wolf pack aren't just defending a piece of land. They're prepared to destroy anyone who dares to take it. This is the story of how one ranch, one warrior, and 3 loyal predators brought an entire cartel to its knees. Proof that some instincts and alliances are forged in blood and never lost. Quick pause before we continue. Welcome to Fabled Frames. Please tell us where you are watching from. Don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is mind-blowing. The remote town of Riverstone, Montana, was not a place outsiders visited frequently. Nestled against a backdrop of jagged peaks and meandering rivers, it was a quiet community shaped by harsh winters and a steadfast frontier spirit. Fewer than 1,000 residents called home, and most of them worked ranches or logging operations scattered among pine forests. The sky was usually clear except during storm season, when a blanket of thick clouds and snow could isolate the entire region from the rest of the world. Cell phone service was spotty at best, and the only paved road in and out was sometimes impassable. Yet in this remote corner of Big Sky Country, life persisted, just on a tougher scale. On a frigid winter morning, 6 black SUVs rolled through the evaporating dawn mist. They stuck out like crows flying across a blank page, foreign vehicles in a place where battered pickup trucks usually ruled the roads. The lead SUV's driver maintained a steady pace, each occupant inside armed and on high alert. Their shared purpose brought them here, a mission that seemed simple enough: intimidate the owner of Silver Pine Ranch, secure the property for their cartel's northern operation, and move on. The men inside the SUVs were convinced this would be routine. Show of force, maybe a few threats, and the ranch would be signed over without a fuss. They had never heard of Victoria Sullivan. If they had, they might have been a bit more careful rolling onto her land. At the threshold of Silver Pine Ranch, a white wooden sign announced the property line in flaking letters that read, Silver Pine Ranch, since 1965. The sign's edges showed bullet holes from bored local hunters or the occasional delinquent who had taken pot shots. In the faint dawn light, the property sprawled across hundreds of acres, with long rolling pastures, stand of evergreens, and a modest cluster of barns. A large log cabin-style house stood at the end of a winding gravel driveway. Typical, the men thought, some ranch in the middle of nowhere, easily seized through intimidation. Inside the lead SUV was a man named Carlos Godoy, second in command to Hector El Halcón Reyes, leader of the Los Águilas Cartel's northern expansion. Godoy had been stationed in this part of Montana for only 2 months, but he had established a network of lookouts, safe houses, and distribution points that stretched from the Canadian border down to Billings. His thick black hair was slicked back, and he wore a heavy coat meant for far warmer climates. Montana's cold was as foreign to him as the ranchers who called home. His instructions were straightforward: scare the rancher off, sign the property over to a shell corporation the cartel controlled, and ensure the shipping route across the ranch's northern boundary remained unchecked. The ranch was near an old logging road that cut through the mountains into Idaho, making it a perfect corridor for moving contraband without running into state patrols. Godoy had done this many times elsewhere in the U.S., identify a strategic property, threaten the owners, and either buy them out or force them to sign. Often it went smoothly. But as the SUVs crept down a driveway, Godoy squinted through the tinted glass at the house. The main structure looked rustic but well-maintained, Thick logs sealed with fresh varnish, large windows for letting in natural light, and a roof lined with protective netting to keep ice dams away. An equally sturdy-looking barn stood a few hundred yards to the right, its double doors closed tight. Farther out, a secondary barn and several riding arenas spread across the land, some partially covered in tarps that rippled in the wintry breeze. The cold morning air raised wisps of steam where the SUV's engines warmed the frosty ground. Upon arriving at the circular parking area near the front porch, the men piled out. Their boots crunched on gravel that was still partially frozen. Each of them wore heavy coats to stave off the sub-freezing temperatures. Godoy's breath came out in puffs as he glanced up at the windows of the house. No lights yet. "Who's in there?" he muttered to his lieutenant, a scar-faced enforcer named Ramon. "Local intelligence says one occupant, the owner. Early 40s, name's Victoria Sullivan. Ex-military, but how tough can she be?" Godoy nodded, silent. Sometimes the easiest-looking jobs turned out complicated. He gestured for his men to spread out around the property, stepping carefully around the iced patches that glinted under the rising sun. As they approached the front porch, the door swung open. Out stepped a tall, lean woman in a heavy flannel jacket. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a loose braid that fell over her shoulder. She wore worn jeans, scuffed boots, and a glint of something cold in her green eyes. Even from a distance, the men sensed a hardened edge in her demeanor. She scanned the vehicles and the men standing by them as if she'd been expecting them. "I figured I'd have guessed this morning," she said, her voice echoing over the crunch of gravel. "You're on private property." A few men reached for their guns, but Godoy waved a dismissive hand, stepping forward to face her. "Senora Sullivan, we're here on a friendly visit. My name is Carlos Godoy. We represent a business interested in acquiring your beautiful ranch." He attempted a disarming smile, though it never reached his dark eyes. One corner of Victoria's mouth twitched, and she slowly descended the porch steps. She was calm. Too calm, in Godoy's estimation. "Business, huh? Is that what you call armed men showing up unannounced?" She looked over the group of at least a dozen men. Her gaze took in each weapon holster, each shift in posture. She recognized the stance of trained gunmen. "I'm not selling my land, if that's what you're wondering." "You misunderstand," Godoy said politely, shifting his stance to keep his hands visible. "We're prepared to make you a very attractive offer for this place. More money than you'll ever see in your lifetime. You could relocate somewhere warmer, maybe. This cold is no good for the bones." Or his tone hardened slightly. "We can do this another way." "You really don't want that." Victoria's lips parted in a smile, so devoid of warmth, it might have chilled them more than the morning air. "I've heard that line before." She stuffed her hands in her jacket pockets. "I suggest you leave. Otherwise, you might find this place less than hospitable." From behind her, a low growl emerged. The men tensed. At first glance, the creatures slowly emerging from the side yard resembled large dogs, but their posture and size were unmistakably wolf-like. Each animal walked with a confident gait, heads level with their shoulders, eyes trained on the strangers. Their coats were thick, some a mixture of white and gray, others darker, with bright amber eyes that glowed in the morning light. One had a half-moon scar over its muzzle, a testament to battles past. These weren't mere pets. They were wolf dogs, massive and alert, each stepping forward with silent menace. A flicker of fear crossed Ramon's face. He was in the back, near the SUVs. Several men exchanged wary glances. They'd faced guard dogs and vicious hounds before, but these creatures were bigger, predators with a feral intensity that made the typical junkyard Rottweiler look tame. Godoy forced a confident sneer. "So what if you have a few big dogs?" He reached under his coat, showing the grip of his pistol. "We have guns." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "You'd be wise to keep that holstered," she said quietly, but her warning was crystal clear. At her subtle signal, the wolves shifted, their hackles rising. The leader of the pack lifted its lips in a silent snarl that displayed long, curved canines. For a moment, no one moved. The early sun, barely cresting the horizon, cast elongated shadows across the snow-dusted gravel. The stiff wind brushed past, whipping Victoria's braid across her shoulder. She stared at Godoy, who maintained a smug front. He was either overconfident or ignorant. Possibly both. "All right," Godoy finally said, drawing out each word. "We'll leave you alone today. But I suggest you reconsider the generous offer we'll be extending. It's in your best interest to sell." He motioned for his men to follow him back to the SUVs. A wave of tension broke as they returned to their vehicles, never fully turning their backs on Victoria or the wolves. Engines roared to life, and the cavalcade reversed back down the driveway. Once they were gone, Victoria let out a long breath. The wolves relaxed, though they remained on high alert. She kneeled down, burying her hands in the thick fur of the nearest animal's neck. "Good job," she murmured, glancing at the receding SUV taillights. "Looks like we'll have company soon enough." Far across the fields, a couple of her horses neighed, sensing the shift in her tension. Victoria straightened and looked over her expansive ranch. The sky was streaked with orange and pink as the sun made its grand entrance behind the mountains. She felt a swirl of old instincts deep in her core, the same instincts she'd honed in the Afghan mountains, where she had once hunted insurgents with local K-9 units. That life was supposed to be behind her, replaced by the simpler rhythms of ranch work, training horse therapy programs for veterans, and caring for her hybrid wolves. But trouble had found her again. As she headed back to the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Los Águilas Cartel wouldn't be content with a polite refusal. Men like that never left quietly. Victoria Sullivan was ready, though. She'd learned to survive in the worst conditions known to man, and her wolf dogs had taught her how to hunt. The men in those sleek, black SUVs would soon learn that her ranch was not a place to be conquered. She only hoped she could protect Riverstone from the fallout. A horse whinnied again in the distance. The mountains echoed with the sound. Victoria turned her gaze toward the horizon, where a storm front brewed. Dark clouds whispered their arrival. Winter in Montana could be unrelenting, and so could she. Before going inside, she paused to share one last look with a half-moon scarred wolf, the alpha of her small pack. The animal's golden eyes held an uncanny intelligence, reflecting the same steadfast loyalty she felt for it. They had been through so much together. Now another battle threatened, and she could sense the electric tension in the wind. There was no turning back. Not that she would have turned back anyway. Would Victoria's warnings and the sight of her wolves be enough to keep the cartel away? Or was she simply fueling the fire of a ruthless organization that wouldn't stop until they had their stronghold? The midday sun hung low in the Montana sky, offering faint warmth to the otherwise biting temperatures. After the tense standoff that morning, Victoria spent the next few hours assessing her ranch. She moved between the horse stalls, checking each animal for signs of stress. Horses were sensitive creatures. Even from the distance of the barn, they must have felt the arrival of dangerous men. Bella, a chestnut mare with a white blaze on her nose, seemed restless. She pawed the ground in her stall and tossed her head whenever Victoria approached. "Easy, girl," Victoria said, placing a reassuring hand on Bella's neck. The horse snorted but gradually calmed, her ears twitching in response to the gentle touch. In the next stall, a gray gelding named Orion flicked his tail, shifting uneasily. Victoria offered him a few hushed words of comfort. As she stroked his mane, her mind wandered to possible scenarios for the days to come. If the cartel returned, how brazen would they be? Would they attempt a direct assault on her ranch, or would they try subtler intimidation? She expected they might test her defenses first, perhaps sabotage equipment, shoot at livestock, or try to damage her property. They'd make it painful, so she'd think twice about standing up to them. She released a slow breath, letting the familiar routines of caring for the horses center her thoughts. The stable's atmosphere was redolent of hay, leather, and fresh manure. Dust motes floated in the shafts of sunlight coming through high windows. This was the life she'd chosen, a simpler, quieter existence compared to the war zone she had known. But her military training had never really left her. She remained vigilant, always ready. Early on, she'd worried that her scars, both physical and mental, would keep her from settling into a normal life. Now those scars felt like armor. Once she finished with the horses, she walked outside, the wolf dogs shadowing her steps. Her trio had been with her for years, adopted from an experimental program overseas that crossbred domesticated dogs with wolves for specialized military tasks. She'd witnessed their intelligence firsthand. They were not just animals to her. They were family and capable partners in defense. The alpha, a large male with iron-gray fur and a scar running along his muzzle, was always at her side. The other two, slightly smaller females, flanked them. Together, they moved as a unit, scanning their surroundings for threats as if patrolling a forward operating base. Victoria stood outside the barn and surveyed the distant perimeter. Mountains rose on three sides, forming a natural barrier. The only easy approach was from the main road where the cartel had rolled in earlier. For added security, she had installed motion sensors and hidden cameras along the tree lines. Maybe that was paranoia, but it also might be what saved her life. She had no illusions about the lengths to which organized criminals would go to secure a prime smuggling route. She knew she wouldn't be alone in this fight. The town of Riverstone might have been small, but folks there looked out for one another. Local ranchers were fiercely protective of each other's land. Sheriff Avery Miles, a weathered lawman who had seen more trouble in his 50-some years than most big city cops, was an old friend. She should probably reach out to him. But she also realized that local law enforcement might be outgunned and out-resourced by the cartel's firepower and cunning. Still, heads up would be wise. The crisp air stung her cheeks. She reached for her phone and checked for service. One or two bars flickered in and out. She scrolled for the sheriff's number and pressed call. The phone rang several times before connecting. A staticky voice answered on the other end. Sheriff's office came the clipped greeting. "Avery, it's Victoria Sullivan," she said, turning her back to the wind to keep the static to a minimum. "Something happened this morning you should know about." "Hey, Victoria. What is it?" The familiarity in his tone hinted at genuine concern. "Got a visit from a group of men in black SUVs. Probably a dozen of them, all armed. They said they were interested in acquiring Silver Pine Ranch. I turned them away, but it was clear they have no good intentions." A long pause. "Mexican. Cartel. Likely." They didn't say it outright, but I recognized the vibe. "They threatened me indirectly. Figured I'd let you know." "Thanks for the heads up," he said, voice grave. "You got names." One called himself Carlos Godoy. That rang a bell. The sheriff let out a slow whistle. "We've had intelligence from federal agencies about a Godoy connected to the Los Águilas Cartel. They've been trying to expand their distribution lines up here. They want a corridor to the border." "That lines up with what I was suspecting," she said, arms folded to combat the cold. "I'm not planning on selling, obviously. But they'll be back, maybe soon. I can handle myself, but this could escalate. My ranch is basically at the crossroads of everything they want." The wind crackled over the line. "Victoria, I know your background, and I know about those wolf dogs you have. You've always been more than capable of defending yourself. But I'll be honest, these guys play rough. Let me see what I can do about extra patrols in your area, though we're stretched thin. If you see any suspicious vehicles or activity, let me know immediately." "Will do," she answered. "Stay safe, Avery." "You too," he replied, and the line went dead. Victoria slipped her phone into her coat pocket, her mind racing with possibilities. Cartel infiltration in remote Montana. Who would have guessed? But their cunning was in targeting out-of-the-way places with limited law enforcement resources. She felt a flicker of anger at the thought of criminals brazenly attempting to strong-arm her. Then she felt that old sense of purpose well up inside her. This was her land, her sanctuary, and she would defend it. She turned to walk back toward the house, the snow crunching underfoot. One of the female wolves let out a soft bark. Victoria followed the animal's gaze and saw a faint figure moving along the edge of her property. Squinting, she recognized a neighbor's truck weaving through the trees. The truck belonged to Scott Delaney, one of the ranchers on the other side of the forested ridge. He was a lanky man in his early 50s, with a beard that grew wild as tumbleweed and an easygoing manner. She relaxed. Scott often drove through the backwoods when checking his own cattle, sometimes crossing onto her land by way of old logging trails. Within minutes, Scott's truck rumbled into view, and he poked his head out the driver's window. "Hey, Vicky," he called, using the shortened name only a handful of people ever attempted. "Saw some suspicious-looking vehicles leaving your place earlier." "Everything all right?" She stepped closer, patting the wolf that stayed near her thigh. "Cartel, most likely. They paid me a friendly visit this morning." Scott's eyes widened, and he ran a hand over his beard. "Cartel? Here. They wanted to buy the ranch. Made a threat or two when I refused," she explained matter-of-factly. "I'm sure they'll come back." Scott let out a low whistle, then gave her a somber look. "You need any help, you know where to find me. My old Springfield rifle still works like a charm, and I got a couple of ranch hands who know how to handle a gun. You're not alone in this." "I appreciate that," Victoria said. It felt good to know her neighbors would stand with her if things got bad. Still, she didn't want to get others harmed in what could be a dangerous conflict. "Town's probably going to hear about this soon," Scott continued, "especially if those guys keep stirring trouble. Folks aren't going to like having that kind of presence around." He glanced at the wolf dogs, his eyes betraying a mix of apprehension and respect for the imposing animals. "Anyway, I'll let you go. Just wanted to check if you were okay." "Thanks," Victoria said, offering him a small nod of gratitude. Scott drove off, leaving tire tracks in the thinning snow. Soon enough, he was just another rumble in the distance. Victoria patted the alpha wolf and murmured, "We're going to need a plan." She headed indoors. The interior of the log cabin house was surprisingly modern, with comfortable furniture, a large stone fireplace, and a fully equipped kitchen. She'd made some renovations over the years, blending the rugged charm of a mountain cabin with the efficiency of modern utilities. Maps of the ranch and surrounding areas decorated a portion of the living room wall. They served as reminders of her domain and provided quick references for search and rescue efforts she occasionally volunteered for. Her next move was to prepare. Preparation was second nature to a woman who had once conducted clandestine missions half a world away. She stepped into a locked room at the back of the house. Inside was a veritable arsenal, kept carefully out of sight. A locked gun safe housed various rifles and shotguns, some standard for ranch work, others more sophisticated. She opened a steel cabinet and retrieved a .308 rifle with a scope, then checked over her favorite sidearm, a customized 9mm pistol with a built-in suppressor. A wave of nostalgia pulled her back to her days in the service. She swallowed hard, reminding herself that while this was her home, there were now enemies poised to storm it. She wouldn't wait for them to bring the fight. That was never her style. But for now, she needed to remain cautious. The last thing she wanted was a full-blown firefight endangering her horses, her neighbors, or the wolves. Montana might be big, but word traveled fast, and the slightest spark could set the whole region ablaze. A few hours later, as the sun began dipping below the white-capped mountain ridges, Victoria stood on her porch with a mug of coffee, warming her hands. The sky burned with the colors of sunset, fiery reds and oranges that slowly faded into purples. She reflected on her day, a jarring confrontation with a cartel that wanted her land, warnings to the sheriff, and the quiet solidarity of a neighbor. The alpha wolf padded onto the porch, eyes fixed on the horizon. Over the distant valley, headlights flickered. More vehicles moving on the main road, possibly heading into Riverstone. Could be anyone, she told herself. Tourists, truckers, or locals coming home. But a subtle tension lay coiled in her, an instinct that told her danger was near. The same heightened awareness she developed in the war zones of Afghanistan where a small detail, an out-of-place silhouette on a hill, a sudden hush of normal sounds, could mean an ambush. Night came quickly. The cold deepened, and she retreated inside. Before turning in, she made the rounds on her security monitors and double-checked her motion sensor system. Each beep or flash carried significance. The monitors displayed a calm perimeter for now. Satisfied, she finally settled down in an armchair near the fireplace, gazing at the flames that danced over the logs. The wolves curled up on the rug, breathing in unison, their ears occasionally twitching at an outside noise. She knew she would not sleep deeply tonight. Every crackle of wood, every gust of wind scraping the window, would keep her on edge. In the back of her mind, she wondered if the cartel was already planning to strike under the cover of darkness. Would the night pass uneventfully, or would the cartel seize the opportunity to test her defenses while the mountains slept beneath a blanket of shadows? Night did not bring an assault, but it brought something else. Sometime after midnight, Victoria was jolted awake by the shrill beep of a motion sensor. She sat up instantly, heart pounding, her training activating like a switch. The wolves roused too, ears perked and heads lifted. She grabbed a flashlight and her 9mm, then hurried to the monitors. One camera feed showed a dark figure moving near the eastern fence line, stumbling as though injured or exhausted. The person's gait was uneven, and they were clearly alone. No vehicles, no signs of other intruders. Victoria's muscles tensed, her breath tight in her chest. Was this a diversion? She pulled on a heavy coat, boots, and a beanie, then went outside with the alpha wolf at her side. Cautiously, she crossed the yard under a flicker of moonlight, occasionally scanning the horizon for any sign of the cartel. The snow crunched under her soles. The wind nipped at her cheeks. Reaching the fence line, she spotted a man in his 20s or early 30s, collapsed against the fence post. He looked pale under the moon's glow, his breath coming in rasps. Blood stained his clothing, and his eyes fluttered as if fighting off unconsciousness. Victoria raised her flashlight, letting its beam illuminate his face. "Who are you?" He struggled to speak, voice cracked. "Names." "Miguel," he said in a thick accent. "Please help." She knelt beside him, one hand in the pistol holstered at her hip, the other gently probing for injuries. She noticed what appeared to be a gunshot wound in his shoulder. The blood was fresh, oozing sluggishly in the cold. She pressed her lips into a thin line. "You're shot." "Stay still." Miguel's eyes fluttered again. "They shot me. I ran." "Who shot you?" He swallowed with difficulty. "Cartel. Los Águilas." A grimace tightened his features. Immediately, her mind reeled. Why was he on her land, fleeing from the same men who had threatened her? Was he a deserter from their organization? A victim who managed to escape? She needed more answers. But first, she had to stabilize him. Montana's freezing temperatures at night were lethal to anyone, let alone someone with a gunshot wound. She whistled softly. The alpha wolf stood guard, ears pricked toward the dark trees. Gently, she helped Miguel to his feet, supporting his weight. Though her instincts told her to be wary, this could be a ploy. She couldn't leave the man out here to die. Little puffs of steam escaped from his mouth as he labored to breathe. Half carrying, half guiding him, she led him toward the house. Her mind churned with caution, every nerve on alert. She pictured armed cartel men lurking in the trees, using Miguel as bait. Yet the property remained silent except for the wind. The motion sensors triggered no additional alarms. If the cartel was there, they were exceptionally skilled at hiding. Inside, she moved him to a guest bedroom and went for her medical kit. She had basic field medic training from her military days, enough to treat a bullet wound if it wasn't too complicated. Removing his jacket and shirt, she found the bullet's entry wound in the upper shoulder, no exit hole. It was still bleeding, but not profusely, likely lodged in the muscle or near the bone. Miguel hissed in pain as she cleaned it with antiseptic and applied gauze to staunch the bleeding. "You had any advanced medical attention?" she asked, though she guessed the answer was no. He shook his head, wincing. No, they shot me hours ago. I kept running. Didn't know where I was. What were you doing with the cartel? She demanded, pressing the gauze firmly. I was working for them. Forced. I wanted out, tried to run. They found out. Tried to kill me. He gasped, biting down as she applied pressure to the wound. Victoria exhaled sharply, meeting his eyes. She detected a mix of shame, fear, and desperation in his gaze. Why'd you come here specifically? Didn't know it was your ranch. I just needed to get as far as possible, he said, voice trembling. The road's at night. I saw lights and fences, so I came this way. She studied him for a moment. The flicker of fear in his face seemed genuine. Well, you're lucky to be alive. Quietly, she inspected the rest of his injuries. Scrapes on his arms, bruises across his ribs that suggested a recent beating. Before stitching him up, she administered a local anesthetic. Her time in the military had taught her how to keep steady hands under pressure, but she was all too aware that she had to do this quickly and cleanly in a non-hospital environment. As she worked, he asked, "Are you going to call the police?" She hesitated. If she brought Sheriff Miles into this, the cartel might be tipped off if they had informants in town. But not calling the sheriff meant going it alone. For now, let's patch you up. We'll figure out the rest in the morning. After she finished dressing the wound, she helped him into a clean shirt and offered him some water. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion. "Thank you," he murmured. "I won't cause you trouble. I promise." Victoria nodded, then led him to lie back on the bed. "Don't try anything stupid. I have 3 wolves outside that won't hesitate if you step out of line." She decided some intimidation might keep him honest. He gave a weak smile. "I saw one. Look strong. I won't do anything." She secured the door, though she didn't lock it. If he was truly an escapee from the cartel, she couldn't treat him like a prisoner. But caution was her default mode. She returned to her living room and updated the sheriff via text, letting him know she'd found a wounded man possibly connected to the cartel. Avery responded with a terse message. "Keep him there. I'll bring a deputy at first light." Exhaling, she sank into the armchair. The wolves settled around her, forming their usual protective circle. She couldn't dismiss the possibility this was a Trojan horse scenario. Still, Miguel's injuries looked authentic, and the fear in his eyes didn't seem faked. The house remained quiet for the rest of the night. Every so often, the alpha wolf rose, circled by the windows, sniffed the cold air, then returned to the rug. Victoria dozed, her hand loosely on her pistol's grip. Memories flickered in her sleep, memories of nighttime raids in foreign deserts, wounded comrades, and the sound of distant gunfire. She woke up each time a log snapped in the fireplace, or the wind groaned against the eaves. Finally, morning arrived with a gray hush. The storm clouds she had seen earlier now loomed overhead, threatening snow. She checked on Miguel, who was still asleep, then brewed a fresh pot of coffee. The wolves took their routine morning trot outside, searching for any sign of intruders. The motion sensors remained quiet. An hour or so later, a patrol car rumbled down the main driveway. She recognized the sheriff's personal SUV behind it, something he often used in deep winter. She grabbed her coat, stepped out onto the porch, and waved them in. Sheriff Avery Miles and a young deputy named Tim Vargas climbed out, each one bundled in thick coats. Steam escaped their lips in white puffs. Avery was in his late 50s, with a gray mustache and a gravelly voice shaped by years of shouting over Montana's roaring winds. Tim was younger, newly minted in the department, with wide eyes that absorbed every detail. "Morning, Victoria," Avery greeted, tipping his hat. "He's still here." She nodded. "Inside, resting. The wound's not life-threatening, I think, but he needs medical care. He claims the cartel shot him because he tried to leave their ranks." They exchanged glances. Avery nodded at Tim, who carried a first aid bag. "Let's have a look." Inside the guest bedroom, they found Miguel sitting up, wincing, his face drawn with pain. Tim carefully removed the makeshift bandage and applied fresh sterile dressings. Avery asked a series of questions, his tone both stern and controlled. Miguel repeated his story: forced recruitment by Los Águilas, a desire to leave, them discovering his plan, and his narrow escape. Avery jotted notes. We can offer you protection if you testify about the cartel's operations. You'll have to come with us, though. Miguel's eyes widened, fear creeping back into them. They'll kill me if they find out. Even in custody, I'm not safe. Victoria shared a look with Avery. They knew the cartel's reach sometimes extended into surprising places. He might be right. If the cartel is determined, small-town protective custody might not be enough. I'll contact the feds, Avery said. They've been after Los Águilas for a while. Could be they'll place him in a witness protection program. But that might take time to arrange. Meanwhile, we have to keep him safe. Miguel swallowed. I don't want to drag you into this more than I already have, Senora. You're not dragging me anywhere, Victoria said curtly, though not unkindly. I'm already a target. Might as well help you if it means hurting the cartel. With that, Avery gently patted Miguel's shoulder. We'll head back to town and get the process started. Victoria, can you keep him here until I get some clearance from my superiors? Might be a day or two. She folded her arms. I can manage. Careful, Avery warned. God, I might already know he's here. You're inviting trouble by housing him, Vic. She shrugged, aware of the risk. They were going to bring trouble anyway. This changes nothing. Avery placed a hand on her arm, a brief gesture of gratitude. I'll update you soon. Tim, let's go. The deputy finished reapplying the bandage, then handed Victoria a set of extra supplies. Miguel thanked him quietly. After the two lawmen left, the house felt heavier with the knowledge of what was coming. Victoria sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee while Miguel rested in the next room. A swirl of thoughts passed through her mind. Was she doing the right thing? Offering refuge to a cartel defector surely put a target on her back tenfold. But she couldn't turn him away. Not her style. She caught herself staring at a framed photograph on the mantel, herself in uniform, standing next to two fellow soldiers in the dusty hills of Afghanistan. She remembered the vow she made when she returned home, that she wouldn't stand by when someone was in danger. The memory stirred a mix of pride and sadness. Though she had hoped to leave the battles behind, she couldn't ignore someone who needed help. Before she could ponder further, her phone buzzed on the table. She flipped it over to see a text from an unknown number. You have something that belongs to us. This is your last warning. Leave Miguel outside your gate at noon, or your ranch will burn. Tension tightened across her shoulders. The cartel had found him, or they suspected she was harboring him. She read the message twice, making sure she understood the threat. She showed the text to Miguel, who looked up at her with frightened eyes. They know I'm here. They'll kill us both. Victoria shook her head. Not if I have anything to say about it. Would Victoria comply with the cartel's demand and give Miguel up, or would she risk open war to protect him on her isolated ranch? The afternoon air was colder than usual, the storm clouds gathering overhead as the cartel's ultimatum weighed on Victoria's mind. Noon was just a couple of hours away. The text message had laid out their demand: surrender Miguel or face the consequences. Instinctively, she wanted to refuse. Morally, she couldn't hand him over to be killed. But she also couldn't ignore the danger it brought to her doorstep. She found Miguel in the guest room, propped up against pillows, staring out the window. When she entered, he turned to her, anxiety etched on his face. I don't want you to get hurt because of me, he said quietly. If it means saving your ranch, maybe I should. No, she cut him off firmly. They don't get to dictate what happens here. You came to me for help. I won't send you back to be executed. He swallowed, eyes dropping to the bandage on his shoulder. They'll come with guns. You know that. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. I do. But this isn't my first fight. Miguel nodded, tears threatening to show in his eyes, though he tried to keep his composure. I appreciate what you're doing. I was forced to run drugs across the border. I never wanted that life. I made mistakes." Victoria placed a hand on his uninjured shoulder. "We've all made mistakes. Doesn't mean you deserve a death sentence." She paused, her voice gentler. "Rest up. Sheriff Miles is working on getting you to a safe place. Until then, you're under my roof." He managed a small nod, and Victoria left the room, her heart heavy with the burden of what was coming. As she walked down the hallway, her phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number, presumably the same one. Clock's ticking. She pocketed the phone, refusing to be intimidated. Outside, the wind picked up, stirring drifts of snow along the edges of the porch. She stood in the open air for a moment, letting the bracing wind sharpen her thoughts. The alpha wolf emerged from behind the house, returning from a perimeter check. The creature's gray fur rippled in the gusts, ears alert. "All clear," she murmured, as though the wolf could understand her. In a sense, she believed it could. She needed a plan. Defending the ranch against a full-fledged assault was daunting, but not impossible. Her property was large, with vantage points and natural chokeholds. The real challenge would be ensuring no harm came to her horses or to Miguel. The stable was a tinderbox. If the cartel wanted to make an example of her, they could torch the barn. She had to prepare for sabotage. She recalled her training. Control the environment, funnel your enemies where you want them, and keep your escape routes in mind. She decided to move the horses to a safer area. An old corral half a mile deeper into her land had a natural windbreak from the trees and was less visible from the road. She'd set up a few makeshift shelters there over the years for emergency use. If a firefight broke out around the main house, at least the horses wouldn't be in the line of fire. It took her nearly an hour of intense labor to move the horses, carefully loading them into her small trailer 2 at a time and transporting them down a rugged trail. Snow flurries began swirling, dusting her coat and the horses' backs. She cursed under her breath. If the weather turned into a storm, it could either help her or complicate everything. By the time she was done, her muscles ached from wrangling anxious horses and wrestling with the trailer in uneven terrain. But a sense of relief filled her when she saw the herd settled in the remote corral. She left extra hay and water in portable troughs, then patted Bella's muzzle. "Stay safe, girl," she whispered, forcing a reassuring smile. Driving back to the house, she resisted the urge to check the time. Let the cartel come, she thought. She had no intention of handing Miguel over, but she had every intention of making the criminals pay if they tried something. Her property, her rules. Upon returning to the ranch yard, she unhitched the trailer and surveyed her domain. The wolf dogs prowled the perimeter, their footfalls silent in the fresh snow. She checked on Miguel, who was resting but watching her carefully. "Just move the horses," she explained. "If there's trouble, they'll be out of harm's way." A flicker of gratitude crossed his features. "I can fight," he offered, motioning to an old revolver lying on a nearby table, one Victoria had confiscated from a locked cabinet earlier. "I'm no soldier, but I'm not useless." She regarded him, noticing how he winced when adjusting his injured shoulder. "You're half dead. Stay inside. If it comes to it, keep your head down, protect yourself. That's all I ask." He nodded, pressing his lips together. "Gracias." She moved to her locked room again, this time pulling out a bulletproof vest she'd kept from her service days. It was well worn but still functional. She slid it on under her jacket. Next came her rifle, loaded and prepared with a spare magazine. She clipped a radio earpiece to her collar, an old set she used on search and rescue missions with local volunteers. While she didn't have a direct link to the sheriff's office, she did have a channel that some neighbors monitored for emergency communications. If needed, she'd call for backup. Time seemed to pass slowly. Noon approached. The wind howled, swirling flakes across the yard in dancing eddies. Even the wolves appeared edgy, ears pivoting at the slightest sound. She checked her phone again. No more texts, That worried her. Silence often signaled that the enemy was ready to move. She took a position on the porch, scanning the long driveway with binoculars. Each minute dragged. The cold air bit into her exposed cheeks, but she ignored the discomfort. Her world narrowed to the potential threat of approaching vehicles. At 5 minutes past noon, she spotted movement. 2 black SUVs entered the mouth of her driveway, headlights cutting through the low-lying snow haze. They advanced slowly, as if expecting a trap. Victoria raised her rifle, but didn't fire. She wanted to see how this played out. The SUVs stopped about 50 yards from the house. 2 men emerged from the first vehicle, for more from the second. She recognized Carlos Godoy among them, his coat and hair looking more suited for a warmer climate. He wore a furious scowl. Another man, taller and thicker in build, circled around the SUV, scanning the ranch yard with a seasoned eye. Possibly a lieutenant or bodyguard. Victoria braced the rifle against her shoulder. She called out from the porch, "That's far enough." Godoy cupped his hands around his mouth. "We gave you a deadline, senorita. You've got something of ours." "I have nothing of yours," she shot back, her voice echoing in the wind. "Leave now, or this won't end well for you." A bitter laugh carried over the gusts. "You think we're bluffing?" Godoy signaled to his men, who spread out, trying to flank the porch. "Hand over Miguel, or we burn it all down." Victoria let out a long breath, steadying the crosshairs of her scope on Godoy's chest. "I'm not handing anyone over to you." Last chance to walk away. "You'll regret this," he snarled. Then, in an instant, the tall lieutenant raised his weapon, a compact submachine gun, and fired a burst at the porch. Bullets splintered the wooden railing, sending shards flying. Victoria dropped low, returning fire with 2 well-aimed shots. The first bullet chipped the side of the SUV. The second clipped the tall man's shoulder, spinning him around. He fell to his knees, cursing in Spanish. The wolves emerged from behind the barn, snarling. One lunged toward a thug who had ventured too close to the house's flank. The man screamed, stumbling back and dropping his rifle as the wolf sank its teeth into his arm. Another cartel member fired at the wolf, missing by inches as the animal darted away, circling with lethal grace. Victoria's heart hammered. The scene exploded into chaos, the crack of gunfire, the roars of men, and the snarls of her wolf dogs. She kept behind the porch's partial cover, firing carefully. She saw one man slump against the SUV, hit in the leg, while Godoy took cover behind the open passenger door, exchanging panicked shouts with his men. Snow whipped around them, reducing visibility to swirling white flurries. The alpha wolf leapt onto the hood of the second SUV, baring its teeth at the men inside. They fired through the windshield, bullets thumping into the dashboard. The wolf launched off and scathed, bounding across the yard. Inside the house, Miguel crouched by a window. His revolver trembled in his good hand, though he hadn't fired. He seemed torn between hiding and trying to help. Bullets ricocheted off the exterior walls, and glass shattered as a round struck a side window. He ducked, heart pounding against his ribs. Victoria ejected a spent magazine and slammed in a fresh one. She peered through her scope, searching for Godoy. He was still taking cover behind the SUV door, scanning for a clear shot at her. Their gazes met for a second. She squeezed the trigger, but he ducked, the bullet smashing the window behind him. A sudden whoosh caught her attention. One of the cartel men was trying to light a Molotov cocktail, likely intending to torch the building. She swore under her breath and sighted in on the man's hand, firing a single shot. The glass bottle exploded in a fiery burst, engulfing him in flames. He shrieked, rolling on the ground in a frantic attempt to extinguish himself. Another gunman attempted to drag him away, cursing in frantic Spanish. The wolves took advantage of the distraction. The alpha lunged at the man, clamping its massive jaws on his leg. He howled, dropping face first into the snow. Another cartel thug tried to line up a shot on the alpha, but Victoria aimed swiftly, taking him down with a bullet to the shoulder. The man spun to the ground, writhing. Blood tinged the snow, and the yard was awash in chaotic violence. The stench of cordite mixed with the acrid smell of burning fuel. Victoria felt a pang in her chest as she realized how quickly her home had become a war zone. Yet she couldn't hesitate. These men would kill her, Miguel, and possibly everyone in the region if given the chance. Godoy's voice erupted in Spanish curses as he shouted at his men to retreat. The surviving members scrambled to the SUVs, dragging wounded comrades. The tall lieutenant, hunched over, fired a few suppressive bursts at Victoria to keep her pinned. She ducked behind the porch, waiting for an opening. Finally, the vehicles roared to life, reversing wildly down the driveway, fishtailing in the snow. Shots rang out from the windows as they sped off, but none connected. In the deafening silence that followed, the wolves circled the yard. One of them limped slightly, having been grazed by a stray bullet. The alpha trotted toward Victoria, ears back, muzzle stained with the tang of blood. She exhaled a shaky breath, crossing to check on the wounded wolf. "Let me see," she whispered, kneeling. The bullet seemed to have grazed the wolf's flank, leaving a bleeding furrow. She pressed a hand to it, trying to staunch the bleeding. The wolf whimpered softly, but did not pull away. "You'll be okay," she murmured. Miguel burst from the house, revolver still trembling in his grip. He stared at the bullet-riddled porch and the burning patch of snow where the Molotov had exploded. Madre de Dios. Victoria stood, her rifle at low ready. Smoke curled from the ruined porch railing. She scanned for any cartel stragglers, but the driveway was empty, tire tracks carved into the snow. "We need to move fast," she said. "They'll regroup. You can't stay here long." Miguel nodded, swallowing hard. "What do we do?" She felt a surge of grim determination. "We call for help," she said, raising her phone with a trembling hand. She realized the adrenaline rush had left her slightly shaky. "And we prepare for the next round. If they brought 6 men this time, they'll bring 20 next time." As if on cue, the storm clouds opened, dropping heavy flakes of snow. Smoke curled from the leftover flames in the yard, and the smell of gunpowder clung to the frigid air. She glanced at the bullet holes peppering her home and swallowed the surge of anger. One thing was clear: the Los Águilas Cartel had escalated to open warfare. Her phone beeped a new text: "We're not finished." Would the next attack come before Victoria could rally the town's defense, or would she have to face the cartel's wrath alone under Montana's gathering storm? Blood stained the snow outside Victoria's porch, evidence of the fierce battle that had raged only minutes earlier. The air still smelled of burnt fuel and gunpowder, and the wind carried an unnatural hush across the land. Snow fell in large, wet flakes, gradually covering the scattered shell casings. Behind the cover of the battered railing, Victoria called Sheriff Avery, her voice taut with urgency. "Avery, they attacked. Gunfight at my place. They retreated, but they'll be back." The line crackled. Avery's voice came through, stern and anxious. "Any casualties on your end?" "Minor injuries. One of my wolves got grazed, but I'm okay. They left some of their guys behind. One's badly burned. The rest ran. I'll get an ambulance and a few deputies out there," Avery said. "Stay put until we arrive, assuming you're secure." "I'll keep watch," she replied, eyes skimming the tree line. "Cartel won't be gone for long." She ended the call. Miguel hovered nearby, revolver still in hand. He looked dazed and exhausted. "Should I get rid of that?" he asked, gesturing to the moaning cartel man who had been engulfed by the Molotov. The snow had doused most of the flames, but his clothing was charred, and his flesh bore severe burns. 2 more men lay in the yard, one unconscious, one writhing with a bullet wound in the leg. Victoria grimaced. She abhorred seeing anyone suffer, even these criminals. "We'll wait for the ambulance," she said simply. "Sheriff's on the way." The alpha wolf approached, limping slightly. Victoria crouched to examine the wound again. "I'm sorry, buddy," she murmured, gently pressing a fresh cloth to the gash. The wolf whined, licking at her hand. She glanced at Miguel. "Help me with some supplies in the house." Together, they hastily created a makeshift bandage for the wolf. Under normal circumstances, she'd have taken the animal to a local vet, but time was precious. Any minute, the cartel could storm back, or the falling snow could intensify, making travel even more precarious. After she secured the bandage, she took a few minutes to bind the prisoner's hands and feet, those who were conscious enough to struggle. She didn't expect them to be grateful, but she refused to let them freeze or bleed to death. They would face justice, not summary execution on her lawn. Eventually, she heard the crunch of tires on snow, followed by sirens. The sheriff and 2 deputies arrived, along with a local EMT volunteer. Guns drawn, they surveyed the carnage. Avery's face hardened when he spotted the bodies and the wounded men, but relief passed over his features when he saw Victoria upright and breathing. "You don't do anything small, do you?" he muttered, stepping carefully around a patch of scorched ground. She gave a terse smile. "They left me no choice." One of the deputies, a young woman named Kate Morrison, moved to secure the cartel men, reading them their rights as she and Tim Vargas, Avery's other deputy, checked for weapons. The EMT rushed to help the burned man, carefully applying bandages and painkillers. He let out an agonizing shriek despite the sedation. Avery eyed Miguel warily. "He was part of this." Victoria shook her head. "He's the reason they came, but he didn't fight. He's a deserter." Miguel raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not armed. I just want to get out of this alive." Avery turned to him, expression skeptical. "We'll sort that out back at the station. For now, you're coming with us. Protective custody, if we can manage that." Miguel's eyes flicked to Victoria. She gave him a reassuring nod. "Go with them. You'll be safer in town than here. At least for the moment." The young man sighed and allowed himself to be escorted to the sheriff's SUV. Meanwhile, paramedics placed the burned cartel member on a stretcher, preparing him for urgent evacuation. Another ambulance was called for the remaining wounded. The men glared venomously at Victoria as if memorizing her face, their eyes promising retribution. She met their glares with a cold, steady resolve. "Let them try." Avery walked the perimeter, shaking his head at the bullet holes in the porch and the barn side. "This is bigger than we can handle on a local level," he muttered. "I'll have to call the state troopers, maybe the feds. But God knows how long it'll take for them to pull together resources out here." Victoria looked at the swirling snow. "We don't have much time. Godoy will strike again, and next time he'll bring more than 2 SUVs. He wants a corridor through my land, and he won't stop until he gets it, or until we stop him." Avery grunted in agreement. "I'll have my deputies keep watch and shifts around here, but we're limited. Half my staff is spread across the county. We got ranchers losing livestock to wolves, families snowed in on back roads. This is not the kind of situation we're equipped for." She exhaled, feeling a knot of frustration. "The town might have to step up, Avery. People out here know how to shoot. We all have to defend ourselves if push comes to shove. And that's what I'm afraid of," he admitted. A vigilante mob isn't exactly the best solution, but the alternative might be letting the cartel run rampant. He glanced over at the alpha wolf. "We can at least transport your injured wolf to the local vet if needed." She shook her head, laying a hand on the wolf's neck. "I'll handle it. He's stable for now, and I don't want him caged or sedated unless absolutely necessary." "All right," he said, trusting her judgment. "Look, I'll see if I can get some extra patrols out here tonight, but that storm's rolling in. If the roads ice up, response times could be hours. Be careful." With that, he clapped her lightly on the shoulder and headed off. The deputies finished collecting evidence, spent casings, footprints, and the remains of the Molotov. Soon, the paramedics and patrol cars departed, leaving Victoria standing alone by her bullet-riddled porch in a swirl of snow. The quiet felt eerie after the flurry of activity. She pressed a hand to her forehead, mentally sifting through what needed to be done. Reinforce the house, patch the bullet holes, restock ammo, double-check the perimeter cameras. The wolves hovered protectively, as if sensing her mounting stress. She patted each one, whispering words of thanks. They had risked their lives for her. She wouldn't forget that. 2 hours later, Victoria was in a barn, rummaging through a pile of old lumber, nails, and tools. She planned to reinforce the windows with planks and add a protective barrier to the porch. She dragged out a circular saw and started cutting boards to size, the whirring blade echoing in the rafters. Outside, the snowfall intensified, large flakes swirling in gusts that seeped through every crack and seam. At the far end of the barn, she kept an old wood-burning stove for winter chores. She lit it to stave off the chill. While the boards warmed near the stove, she examined her battered porch railing. A bullet had lodged in a support beam. Another had cracked a window behind the living room. She was grateful the house hadn't caught fire from a Molotov. That was the cartel's next step, she guessed, attempt to burn her out. As dusk approached, she had boarded up the lower windows and replaced the shattered glass in the living room with heavy plywood. The place looked more like a fortress than a ranch home. Her breath frosted the air as she worked. She took quick breaks to drink coffee or warm her hands by the stove. All the while, her senses remained on alert for the sound of approaching vehicles. None came. Finally, darkness fell, and she retreated inside. She stoked the fireplace, feeding it fresh logs, then stood there, letting the heat brush over her numb fingers. The wolves lay sprawled on the rug, tongues lolling as they panted. The alpha seemed to move gingerly, but at least the bleeding from his flank wound had stopped. She checked it again, disinfecting the area and adding fresh gauze. "You've done enough for one day," she whispered to the injured wolf. "Rest." Then her phone rang, a call from an unknown number. She answered, heart thudding. "Victoria Sullivan?" A male voice asked, brisk and formal. "Speaking. This is Agent Darren Cole, Day. We got wind from Sheriff Miles about your situation. We're looking to coordinate, maybe relocate the subject, Miguel Lopez, to a secure location. But it might be a few days before we get the necessary arrangements." She swallowed. "The cartel could wipe me out by then, Agent Cole. They already attacked once." He sighed. "I understand your concern, ma'am. We can try to expedite resources, but we're spread thin. There's a major operation down in Arizona. Let me see what I can do. If the sheriff's department can keep them at bay for a bit, we'll step in soon." She sensed a dismissive tone in his voice, as though she were merely an afterthought in a bigger federal puzzle. Anger sparked in her chest. "I'd appreciate any help you can offer. My ranch is not going to be a battlefield for very long. If they come again, I'll meet them head-on." "Understood," Cole said, his tone even. "I'll contact you with updates." "Don't do anything rash, Ms. Sullivan." The line went dead. She gritted her teeth, realizing that the feds had left her to hold the line for an indefinite period. She slid her phone away. Doing nothing rash wasn't exactly an option, not with the cartel breathing down her neck. She spent the next few hours making additional preparations. Inside her locked storage room, she checked her supply of ammunition. She had enough to hold off a small army, if she was smart and strategic. The memories of old missions in Afghanistan bubbled to the surface, how she would plan ambushes, set traps along mountain trails, coordinate canine patrols. She might have left the battlefield, but the knowledge remained. Eventually, exhaustion weighed on her. She settled in a corner of the living room, rifle by her side, and tried to rest. The wolves curled protectively around her, providing a circle of warmth. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the log walls. Outside, the storm battered the ranch, wind rattling the boarded windows. The scene was both peaceful and tense, a lull in the storm before the next wave of violence. A fitful doze overtook her, haunted by half-formed dreams of desert battles blending with snowy fields. She woke multiple times, scanning the monitors and listening for intruders. But the night passed uneventfully. No SUVs plowing through the storm, no bursts of gunfire. Morning arrived with a muted gray glow filtering through the clouds. The snowfall had stopped, leaving behind a thick blanket of white. Everything looked pristine, deceptively serene. With the day's first light, she stepped outside, boots crunching in the new snow, to see if any tracks indicated overnight visitors. None. She felt a cautious relief. As she prepared to check on her horses, a single shot echoed across the fields. She froze, heart pounding. Another shot followed, muffled by the pines to the north. Slipping her rifle sling over her shoulder, she sprinted toward the sound, the wolves at her heels. The cold air cut her lungs, and her breath misted in front of her. She crested a small ridge behind the barn and scanned the distance. Nothing moved among the snow-covered trees. Then a faint cry. She recognized a voice. Scott Delaney, her neighbor, yelling for help. Without hesitation, she pushed forward into the pines, rifle raised. The wolves bounded alongside her, senses attuned to every rustle. The deep powder made each step a slog. Finally, she spotted Scott kneeling in the snow, clutching his leg. Blood seeped through his jeans. He was about 50 yards from a dead deer. A fresh bullet wound in the animal's flank. "Scott," she yelled, hurrying to him. "Are you shot?" He winced, teeth clenched. "Grazed. Caught me when I was out here looking for tracks. Some men in dark coats took a shot at me, then ran off." She looked around, pulse thudding. "Cartel." He nodded, eyes wide. "Sounded Spanish, a few words I heard. They sprinted off that way." He pointed deeper into the trees. "Might be heading to the old logging road." She cursed under her breath, helping him stand. "Can you walk?" He winced. "Barely. Bullet tore a chunk out of my calf. Hurts like hell, but it's not bleeding too bad." She slung his arm over her shoulder, supporting his weight. The wolves paced anxiously, scanning the snowy forest. Scott's eyes flicked nervously. "They said they'd kill me if I didn't tell them where Miguel was. I tried to act dumb, but one of them shot anyway." Her jaw tightened. The cartel was scouring the area, interrogating neighbors. That meant no one was safe. She helped them hobble back toward the ranch, occasionally glancing behind. Every rustle of branches put her on edge. Would they come back to finish the job? Once they reached her yard, she helped him inside, bandaging his leg carefully with supplies from her medical kit. He hissed in pain, but she kept the pressure steady. "You'll be okay," she murmured. "Just keep it elevated. I'll call for help." She left him in the living room, near the fireplace for warmth. Her phone connection was spotty, but she managed to get hold of the local clinic. They said they'd send someone as soon as possible, though the roads were still treacherous from last night's snowfall. She sighed, checking the window for any sign of the cartel. Nothing, just the empty yard and distant pines. Returning to Scott, she knelt beside him. "They're sending a nurse or paramedic once the road's clear." "Did they say anything else?" He grimaced. "They just kept asking about Miguel. Wanted to know if he was at your place or if he left town. I played dumb, said I barely knew him." Her anger flared. "They'll keep going until they find him or kill anyone who helps him." "But the sheriff has Miguel under protection in town." A weary expression creased Scott's features. "Is that enough protection?" She hesitated. "I doubt it. But at least in the station, he's not an easy target. Still, Vicky, they're out there. I saw at least 4 of them. There could be more. You gotta be careful." She nodded, tension coiling in her stomach like a snake. If the cartel had men combing the woods, it was only a matter of time before they attempted another strike on her ranch, especially if they believed she was hiding more intel on Miguel. She thought of the community meeting the sheriff, sometimes called in times of crisis. Perhaps that was needed now. The townspeople had to be warned, and they needed to band together. Helping Scott to a more comfortable position, she handed him a cup of water. The alpha wolf approached cautiously, sniffing at the new arrival, then gently pressed its nose against Scott's hand. He gave a faint smile. "Guess that means I'm approved," he joked weakly. Victoria managed a small chuckle, though her heart was heavy. "Rest up," she said. "I'll keep watch outside." She stepped onto the porch, letting the icy air sharpen her senses. The storm clouds had thinned, revealing patches of a pale winter sky. The wind carried a biting chill, but no new snow. Her gaze swept across the driveway, the tree line, the distant ridge. She sensed danger everywhere, an unease that refused to dissipate. Will Victoria's next move be to rally the townspeople to defend against the cartel? Or will the criminals outmaneuver her and strike again before she could gather allies? By late morning, a local paramedic arrived in a battered truck, chains on the tires, to tend to Scott's injury. The nurse, a woman named Clara, cleaned the wound thoroughly and wrapped it in fresh bandages, administering a mild painkiller. She was an older lady, hair tightly pulled back under a knit cap, and she exuded a calm efficiency that put Scott at ease. "You'll be fine," she said, patting his shoulder. "Just need to stay off that leg a few days. Let it heal." Scott gave a grateful nod. "Thanks, Clara. It's just my luck to wander into a gunfight in the pines." Clara shot Victoria a knowing look. "We need to talk about the bigger problem here, the folks prowling around with guns." Victoria ran a hand over her face, weary. "Yeah, we do. They're cartel men, I'm sure of it. They're after Miguel Lopez, who's currently in custody. But now they're harassing and shooting at neighbors. This can't continue." Clara pursed her lips. "People in Riverstone are scared. Word's spreading fast. Some folks are packing up to stay with relatives in bigger towns until this passes." Victoria felt a pang. She didn't want to see her community uprooted. "That's understandable. But for those who are staying, we need a plan." Clara gave a brisk nod. "You call the sheriff yet?" "He's aware," Victoria replied, "but they're stretched thin. He suggested rallying the town, maybe calling a public meeting. We need to coordinate a defense, or at least share information. The cartel is used to bullying small communities. We can't let them do that here." Scott leaned forward, despite wincing from pain. "A meeting at the community center might be best. The old church is too small. We'd want as many folks as possible to attend." Clara glanced at the clock on her phone. "I'll head back and spread the word. See if the sheriff can meet us there this evening. Everyone has a stake in this." Victoria appreciated their willingness to help. "Count me in. I'll come into town once I'm sure the ranch is secure." With that, Clara packed her supplies, handed Scott some extra bandages, and left in her truck, navigating the slick driveway slowly. Victoria turned her attention back to the day's tasks. She needed to ensure her horses remained safe in the hidden corral, check the perimeter sensors, and maybe establish some booby traps along the main approaches. If the cartel wanted a fight, they'd get more than they bargained for. However, she also knew her presence in town was vital. She had direct experience facing these men, and the people of Riverstone needed to hear that defending themselves was possible. Fear could break a community, but unity could hold it together. She found herself walking Scott to her pickup truck, the paramedic having cleared him for short rides if necessary. "Stay at my place in town," he insisted. "Nobody's using it. My brother's out of state. Keys under the gnome by the porch steps. You can keep an eye on me until I can hobble around better." Victoria raised a brow. "You trust me alone in your house?" He gave a pained laugh. "I trust you more than I trust most folks. And I'm not about to leave you out here if the cartel's prowling." She appreciated the gesture, but she was torn. The ranch was her home, her fortress. Still, if the cartel attacked again in greater numbers, she might be safer near the sheriff's station, especially with limited manpower available to respond. The rational part of her knew it might be wise to relocate for now, but her heart clenched at the thought of abandoning Silver Pine Ranch to potential arson or vandalism. She was determined, however, to attend the community meeting in Riverstone that evening. "All right," she relented, helping him into the passenger seat of her old pickup. The wolves hopped into the bed with surprising agility, despite the alpha's healing wound. She couldn't leave them behind. Let's go see what we can accomplish in town. The drive into Riverstone was slow and tense. Fresh snow coated the roads, and patches of ice lurked in the tire ruts. Pine trees lined a narrow route, their branches heavy with white. She kept her rifle on the seat beside her, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting black SUVs to appear. But the road stayed quiet. Riverstone was a modest town, a single main street with a diner, a grocery store, a few small shops, and a wooden community center that doubled as a gym and event hall. A tiny police station stood off a side street, and an old church tower overlooked the cluster of buildings. The population hovered around 800, most living on the outskirts or in small clusters of houses. Today, the streets were less populated than usual. People likely stayed indoors, the cold and fear of violence keeping them in. She pulled up to Scott's house, a 2-story log home near the south edge of town. True to his word, a small concrete gnome guarded the porch steps. She found the key underneath its pedestal. Carefully, she helped Scott inside and settled him on a couch in the warm living room, which had a big picture window overlooking the street. The wolves padded in after her, sniffing around warily. She laid out water bowls for them, along with some dog food she found in a pantry. Scott must have owned a dog once. "Make yourself at home," Scott said wryly. "Just keep the door locked." She nodded, grabbing her phone. "I'm going to find Avery, check on Miguel, see about that meeting." "Be careful," he warned, hand resting on his bandaged leg. She gave him a reassuring grin, though her heart felt heavy. "Always am." Outside, the wind stung her face again, carrying an unrelenting chill. She locked the door behind her, double-checking that the wolves were content to stay with Scott for the moment. Then she strode through a few blocks of mostly deserted sidewalks, snow crunching underfoot. A handful of residents peered from windows, some nodding at her in silent greeting, others looking away uneasily. She passed an older man, salting his walkway. He tipped his cap but didn't speak. A few minutes later, she reached the sheriff's station, a modest brick building with 2 squad cars parked out front. Inside, the heat hit her like a wave. Deputy Kate Morrison sat at the front desk, expression grim. She broke into a relieved smile upon seeing Victoria. "Thank goodness you're all right. Heard there was more trouble out by your place." Victoria rubbed her numb fingers together. "Scott Delaney got shot. Minor wound. Cartel's definitely sniffing around." "Avery in?" Kate nodded. "He's in back with Miguel." She pressed a button to buzz Victoria through. "They're setting up a time for the community meeting at the center this evening." Victoria stepped through the door into a small hallway lined with wanted posters and official notices. She found Avery in a cramped office, leaning over a metal desk. Miguel sat across from him in a plastic chair, arms folded over his chest. Both men looked up as she entered. "Victoria," Avery said, tension carving lines into his face. "You heard about Delaney?" She nodded. "Just brought him into town, patched up. The cartel's checking houses, probably. Threatening neighbors. It's going to get worse." Avery grunted. "We're setting up a meeting at 6 p.m. at the community center. Trying to get everyone who's staying in town to attend. We'll discuss a coordinated plan, maybe a neighborhood watch on steroids." Miguel met her gaze. "I'm sorry about your friend," he said softly. "They won't stop until they find me." She shook her head. "Don't blame yourself. They'd come after me, whether or not you were here, since I'm the one standing in their way." Avery sighed, rubbing a hand over his graying mustache. "Miguel's been telling me what he knows about the cartel's operations in Montana. He says Godoy has about 20 men up here, some scattered across safe houses. They're well-armed, well-funded. Federal backup is still days away, if that. We're on our own for now." Victoria's jaw clenched. 20 men. Enough to terrorize a small town, but perhaps not enough to hold it if the townsfolk united. "We need to make sure everyone knows how to protect themselves." Reinforce their homes, set up a phone tree, keep the roads monitored. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, the squeaking metal revealing his exhaustion. We might also consider some sort of early warning system, spotters on the highway and the back roads. If we see an influx of suspicious vehicles, we can coordinate a response. Miguel looked hesitant. If it helps, I can identify their vehicles and the men in the group. I remember faces, names, license plates. That would be helpful, Avery agreed. Keep sharing anything you recall. After discussing details for the evening meeting, Victoria headed back out into the cold. She wanted to spread the word to a few folks she knew personally. Ranchers like the Delaney's, local shop owners, and the staff at the diner. As she wandered down Main Street, she saw folks peeking from doorways. She stopped in at the diner, where the smell of coffee and frying bacon greeted her with a comforting warmth. A few regulars hunched over the counter, but the place wasn't as lively as usual. Ruby, the middle-aged waitress who knew everyone in town, waved her over. "Hey, honey. Heard some bad stuff is going on." Victoria nodded, leaning on the counter. "Cartel trouble. We're having a meeting at 6 at the community center. Spread the word." Ruby's eyes widened. "Of course I will." She wiped her hands on her apron, worry tightening her features. "Do you think we'll be safe?" "We're going to make sure of it," Victoria replied, injecting as much confidence into her voice as she could muster. She spent another hour making rounds, speaking with whoever she could. Some folks were already planning to board up their homes, while others were defiant, boasting about shotguns and old hunting rifles. Yet the undercurrent of fear was palpable. This was a small town, not used to organized violence. The possibility of a cartel incursion weighed on everyone. By early afternoon, she returned to Scott House, her limbs cold and heavy. The wolves greeted her at the door, tails wagging softly. She placed her rifle by the wall, then knelt to rub their heads. "Missed me," she whispered. The alpha bumped its head against her shoulder. She checked on Scott, who napped on the couch, then sank into a chair by the window, letting out a long breath. It was surreal, being away from her ranch in a borrowed home, the entire town bracing for war. She found her thoughts drifting to the farmland, the stable, the corral where her horses were. Were they truly safe? She wanted to return, but the practical side of her told her she needed to show solidarity in town, not to mention coordinate with Avery. As darkness approached, she and Scott, who insisted on coming despite his injury, made their way to the community center. He hobbled on a pair of borrowed crutches. Snow crunched underfoot, illuminated by the glow of streetlights. The center was a large wooden building originally used as a school gym decades ago, now repurposed for town gatherings. People were already gathering. Pickup trucks lined the makeshift parking lot, forming a ragged row in the snow. Families, couples, and a few older folks shuffled inside, some wearing anxious expressions. The overhead light in the hall buzzed dully, revealing rows of metal folding chairs. A dais in front served as a stage, with few battered tables set up to hold coffee urns and refreshments. Sheriff Avery stood near the stage, conferring with Deputy Kate Morrison and a few volunteers from the Volunteer Fire Department. Victoria helped Scott to a seat near the front, repropped his crutches against the chair. The wolves remained outside, tied gently to the railing. She didn't want to scare the townsfolk. A hush settled over the crowd as more people filed in, maybe 70 or 80 in total, about as many as she expected from a tight-knit community in crisis. Miguel was nowhere to be seen, likely kept safely at the station for now. When it seemed most had arrived, Avery cleared his throat and addressed the room. "Evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. You all know me, Avery Miles. I've been sheriff here for almost 10 years. What we're facing is unprecedented for Riverstone, an organized criminal group, the Los Águilas Cartel, seeking to establish control of some properties in our county. They've attacked folks, threatened landowners, and shot at neighbors. We're here to decide how to protect ourselves until we get federal or state backup." A murmur went through the crowd. One man in a flannel jacket shouted, "Why do we have to wait for backup? We can handle this ourselves. A few voices responded in agreement. Avery raised a calming hand. I understand the sentiment, but we have to be smart. Running into the hills with rifles might get folks killed needlessly. We need to coordinate effectively. Deputy Morrison stepped forward, reading from a notepad. The cartel presence is estimated at around 20 men, heavily armed and spread out. They may have vehicles with tinted windows, black SUVs, or pickups they purchased locally. They're looking for Miguel Lopez, a defector, and they're trying to seize certain properties, including Silver Pine Ranch. At that, heads turned toward Victoria. She took a breath and stood. She briefly described the attacks on her ranch, showing the bullet graze on her jacket, explaining how they tried to burn her porch. Gasps and angry, muttering rippled across the room. Make no mistake, she concluded, voice firm. They won't stop until they have a smuggling corridor, or until we drive them out. If we stand together, we can defend our town. A bearded rancher in the back piped up. Are we supposed to just open fire on anyone suspicious? No, Avery said sternly. We're not a lynch mob, but we'll set up neighborhood watches, patrols in pairs or small groups, armed if necessary. Report suspicious activity to my office. We'll do quick response teams. We have a handful of deputies and volunteers from the fire department who can help coordinate. Another voice. What about you, Ms. Sullivan? You have some kind of special forces training, right? Victoria's cheeks warmed. She wasn't used to discussing her military background openly. I serve in Afghanistan, yes? I can help train folks who need it. Rifle marksmanship, security setups. The room erupted in chatter. Some were eager to sign up for her training. Others looked frightened. A middle-aged woman near the front asked, "What about those of us who don't own guns? Should we just barricade our doors?" Victoria exchanged a glance with Avery. She answered, "Barricading your doors is a start. Reinforce them, keep lights on at night, be in close contact with neighbors. If you can safely get a firearm and learn the basics, that's an option. But no one's being forced to fight. We just want you safe." A concerned father in a baseball cap raised his hand. "I've got 2 kids. If these men come for us, I'll shoot to kill. That's not a crime, right, Sheriff?" Avery nodded slowly. "If your life is in immediate danger, you have the right to defend yourself. Just be sure you're not shooting blindly." The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours, a flurry of questions, concerns, and proposed solutions. Ultimately, they formed a plan: volunteer patrols and rotating shifts, a phone tree for rapid communication, designated safe houses for anyone threatened. Victoria offered 2 daily training sessions, one at dawn, another at dusk, for basic firearm handling and tactical awareness. The tension in the room was thick, yet there was a sense of unity forming. By the time it ended, folks shuffled out with a mix of determination and apprehension. Some lingered, forming small clusters to discuss details. Avery approached Victoria, exhaustion evident in his eyes. "You did good in there. People trust you. They know you can handle this." She nodded, her own fatigue creeping in. "I hope they trust themselves too. We'll need everyone's courage." Outside, the wolves perked up at her approach, tails wagging. She scratched their ears absently, scanning the dark streets. No suspicious vehicles. The lampposts illuminated swirling snowflakes drifting in a breeze. Scott left with a neighbor who offered him a ride home. He flashed Victoria a grateful thumbs up. "Come by later if you want." Mi casa es su casa, as they say. She mustered a small smile. "Thanks, Scott." As the crowd dispersed, Avery locked up the community center, then turned to her. "You gonna stay in town tonight?" She hesitated, her heart pulled toward her ranch. "I'll head back to Scott's for now. Early tomorrow, I'll do the morning training for whoever shows up. Then I need to check on my horses." "All right," he said, patting her shoulder. "Stay safe." She led the wolves down the quiet street, passing dark windows and shuttered doors. A brittle wind whispered through the eaves. Her instincts screamed that the cartel was likely plotting their next move. But for the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. Riverstone, for all its small size and limited resources, was a community ready to stand by her. She only hoped it would be enough. Would the newly united townspeople prove a match for the cartel's ruthless tactics, or would the criminals strike before the plan could even be fully implemented? First Light found Victoria at the makeshift firing range by the edge of town, a wide patch of snow-covered ground backed by a sturdy earthen berm. The cold gnawed at her fingertips. She wore insulated gloves, which she peeled off whenever she needed to demonstrate a firing stance or reloading technique. Around her, a small cluster of townspeople gathered, mostly ranchers and local hunters, along with a couple of middle-aged mothers who were new to firearms. "This is a standard AR-15, she announced, holding the rifle so everyone could see. Her breath formed puffs of steam. Anyone not familiar with it stepped forward. Two ladies raised their hands, looking nervous. Victoria gave them a reassuring nod, placing the rifle on a folding table. "We'll start with the basics: loading, safety checks, stance, trigger to discipline." She spent the next hour patiently walking them through each step. The group took turns firing into paper targets tacked onto plywood sheets. The sharp crack of gunshots echoed over the snow, and spent casings flew. A few had shaky aim at first, but with gentle coaching, they improved. Others, like the old ranchers, handled their rifles with practiced ease. One man, an ex-Marine named Colton, volunteered to assist with instruction. Victoria was grateful. He validated her techniques and offered additional pointers. Slow, steady breaths, he advised a nervous farmer. "Don't jerk the trigger. Squeeze it." By the end of the session, many participants looked more confident. They had also learned basics like how to clear malfunctions and properly store their weapons. She reminded them about the next session at dusk. "Between now and then, reinforce your homes," she concluded. "If you see anything off, call the sheriff immediately. Don't confront the cartel alone." They dispersed, heading back to their cars or trudging across the snowy field to the main road. Victoria rubbed her gloved hands together, feeling a knot of worry that still refused to loosen. Teaching them the fundamentals was one thing, but facing trained cartel gunmen was another. She took down the paper targets and policed the empty brass casings from the snow, wanting to leave the area clean. Colton approached, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Thanks for setting this up," he said. "Reminds me of the old days on the range." She nodded, a wry grin curling her lips. "I just hope it helps." "Better than nothing," he replied. "I'll be at the evening session. Let me know if there's anything else you need." She thanked him and watched as he walked off. A winter sun glinted weakly through hazy clouds. She felt the alpha wolf at her side, pressing its flank against her leg. The other two wolves sniffed around the field. The brisk air cleared her mind, yet the fear of impending violence hung like a specter. Once she finished tidying up, she headed back into town. Before checking on Scott, she swung by the police station. The door squeaked as she entered. Deputy Kate Morrison was there, sipping coffee at the front desk. She flashed a tired smile. "Morning, Ms. Sullivan. The sheriff's out patrolling with Tim. Everything okay?" Victoria set down her gear bag. "Finished the training. Figured I'd see if we've had any new reports of cartel activity." Kate nodded grimly. "We got a call from one of the logging camps up in the hills. A few men matching the cartel's description were snooping around, asking questions about you, about the sheriff, about Miguel. They threatened the foreman." Victoria's shoulders tensed. "Any confrontation?" "Not yet. The foreman's holed up with his crew, armed themselves with hunting rifles. Sheriff's trying to get up there if the roads allow." Victoria sighed. "They're pushing outward, searching for any advantage. If they corner some of these isolated folks, could turn ugly fast." Kate's gaze flickered with concern. "I've been calling in every favor I can from the state troopers. They're short-staffed too. Maybe the National Guard is an option, but that's a whole bureaucratic process." Glancing around the station, Victoria noticed how empty it was. A skeleton crew for a small town. We'll do what we must, she said, lifting her chin. I want to check on my ranch this afternoon, see how my horses are holding up. Then I'll be back for the evening training. Kate nodded. Be careful out there. On the way out, Victoria paused, remembering something. How's Miguel? He's still in protective custody. We're keeping him in the locked holding cell for his own safety. Ironically enough, Fed contact says they might expedite relocating him, but no definite timeline. Victoria grimaced. All right, let me know if anything changes. She left, returning to Scott's house to briefly pack her things and gather the wolves. Scott was awake, reading an old paperback novel. He eyed her with worry. Heading back to the ranch? Alone, she slung her rifle. I've got my wolves, and I can handle myself. You just keep resting. You want me to bring you anything? He gestured to his bandaged leg. Just my pride if you find it lying around somewhere. She managed a small laugh. Take care, Scott. Outside, the midday sun sat high behind a veil of clouds, the temperature barely above freezing. She warmed up her pickup, the wolves hopping in the back. As she drove out of town, she scanned a rearview mirror constantly. Her stomach knotted every time another vehicle appeared, but it was always a familiar pickup or a logging truck. The cartel's presence, though hidden, seemed to loom everywhere. Finally, she turned onto the rutted path leading to her ranch, half buried in snow. The drive felt unnervingly quiet. She exhaled in relief when the log cabin and barn came into view, standing amid drifts of white. Signs of the previous gunfight still marked the property. Splintered porch rails, bullet holes in the barn siding, a charred patch on the ground. No new tire tracks or footprints. She parked near the house, jumped out, and let the wolves roam free. The alpha trotted around, sniffing for intruders. She headed to check the hidden corral where her horses were. The trek through the deeper snow took time, but soon she reached the enclosure. Relieved, she found the horses safe, huddled under a makeshift shelter. They neighed softly at her approach, clearly missing her presence. Hey, babies, she called, patting Bella's side. The mare whinnied, nuzzling her jacket. Victoria examined them for any signs of injuries or stress. They seemed okay for now, albeit restless. She refilled their water trough and tossed them fresh hay from a stacked bale. You'll be back in the stable soon, she promised, once this madness is over. Returning to the main house, she decided to walk the perimeter, rifle at the ready. The crisp air carried a hush. The pine trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches heavy with snow. She moved in a cautious, deliberate manner, scanning each section of fence, checking for footprints or new damage. The wolves patrolled with her, occasionally growling at small, scurrying animals. No sign of the cartel. Eventually, she found herself near the boundary line where the first confrontation with the SUVs had happened. She paused, kneeling to inspect faint tire tracks partially filled with snow. The memory flooded back. Gunfire, shattered glass, snarling wolves. She shook off the flashback and pressed on. Back at the house, she decided to gather whatever supplies she needed, extra clothes, ammunition, medical gear, and bring them into town. In case she had to stay there for multiple days, she wanted to be prepared. She also rummaged through her father's old trunk, seeking any additional firearms that might be serviceable. An ancient shotgun, a lever-action rifle, might be useful to distribute to townsfolk who didn't have weapons. She set them aside, making a mental note to check them for functionality. Loading the gear into her truck, she took a final look at her home. The battered porch, the boarded windows. She felt a surge of anger at the cartel for bringing war to her doorstep. But she refused to yield. If anything, it steeled her resolve. She started the engine again, letting it idle as she checked her phone. A text from an unknown number froze her breath. We have a little surprise for you in town. Enjoy. Alarm surging through her, she threw the truck into gear, fishtailing down the driveway. The wolves braced themselves in the back. She hammered the accelerator, fear spiking her heart rate. What surprise had the cartel laid in Riverstone? Was it an ambush, a bomb, a kidnapping? She fumbled for her phone to call Avery, but the signal flickered in and out. Damn it, she hissed, swerving around a patch of ice. Once she got onto the main road, she tried again. This time it rang. The sheriff picked up, tension in his voice. "Victoria," she blurted, "the cartel sent me a message, said they have a surprise in town. Everything all right there?" Avery's voice crackled. "We got a call about an explosion near the feed store, possibly a fire. Fire department's en route, but we can't confirm details yet. You heading back?" "I'm almost there," she replied, swallowing a burst of adrenaline. "On my way." He paused, static filling the line. "Be careful. Could be a trap." The call ended abruptly. Victoria gritted her teeth, focusing on the road. Another 15 minutes passed in slow agony as she navigated the snow-packed pavement. Finally, she rounded the last bend and saw plumes of black smoke drifting into the sky near the center of town. Her stomach lurched. She sped toward the feed store, a long, low structure that supplied grain, hay, and hardware to local ranchers. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance. Flames licked at the building's backside, smoke billowing. The volunteer fire department had arrived, hooking up hoses to a nearby hydrant. Water sprayed onto the blaze with a hiss and hiss, steam clouding the chilly air. She parked on the outskirts, leaping out with rifle in hand. The wolves jumped down, sniffing the air warily. People were shouting, moving back as the fire crackled. Avery stood by his patrol car, issuing directives into his radio. "What happened?" Victoria demanded, rushing up. Avery grimaced. "We're still piecing it together. Witnesses say 2 men pulled up in a dark SUV, tossed something inside the store, and took off. Moments later, fire broke out. We're lucky no one was inside. No injuries, but the building's half gone." Victoria stared at the flames with clenched fists. The feed store was a cornerstone for local ranchers. Destroying it would hamper the town's ability to care for livestock, a direct blow to the community's heart. She scanned the bystanders, spotting fear and anger on their faces. Some recognized her, frustration flickering in their eyes, as if to say, "You brought this war here." Guilt twisted her gut, though she knew the blame lay with the cartel. She turned to Avery. "Any sign of the men who did this?" He shook his head. "Gone by the time we arrived. Deputies are searching the roads. If they know we're short-staffed, they'll keep doing stunts like this, targeting businesses, scaring folks into silence." Her phone buzzed again. Another unknown message. "You like our work? We can do more. Bring us Miguel or watch your town burn." She hissed in frustration. "They're demanding Miguel again. They think torching Riverstone will force us to give him up." Avery spat on the ground, rage simmering. "They're messing with the wrong town." He glanced around at the cluster of residents who were beginning to voice their anger. People demanded answers. Who did this? Where are the cops? We can't live like this. Victoria felt an urge to address them. She climbed onto the edge of a nearby pickup and raised her voice. "Everyone, listen." The crowd turned, falling quiet except for the crackle of flames. "This is the work of the Los Águilas Cartel, terrorizing us into submission. But we won't bow. We're going to stand together. They want us to hand over Miguel, but that won't stop them from taking over anyway. We fight back or we lose our homes." Some cheered, others just looked grim. A murmur of agreement passed through the throng. The volunteer firefighters redoubled their efforts, dousing the blaze. Would the cartel continue escalating their attacks until the town broke? Or would Riverstone's defiance push them into a risky, large-scale confrontation that could decide the fate of everyone involved? The day's remaining sunlight was a somber glow over Riverstone. Smoke lingered from the feed store fire, and the charred remains of the building hissed where embers met water. Word spread quickly about the cartel's brazen attack. Businesses closed early, and families locked their doors. The streets emptied. It felt like a ghost town preparing for a siege. Inside the community center, Victoria helped arrange the evening training session. Tables were pushed aside to create space for demonstrations, and a handful of dedicated townsfolk arrived, grim-faced and ready to learn. She repeated many of the same lessons from the morning range session: safe handling, reloading drills, how to move behind cover. But now the tension was more palpable. People weren't just learning to shoot for sport, they knew they might soon face lethal combat. Afterwards, she volunteered Colton to handle Q&A while she stepped outside for fresh air. The wolves followed, padding silently at her heels. The sky was dark, a few stars peeking through the haze of smoke. She leaned against the building, arms folded, mind churning with worry. Each training session helped, but would it truly be enough against seasoned killers? Her phone vibrated. Another text from a block number. "We're coming tonight. Ready to die for that traitor?" Cold dread trickled down her spine. She gripped the phone, staring at the message. They were coming. Tonight. How many? From where? She inhaled sharply, steadying herself. She had to alert Avery, rally whoever could fight, and brace the town for an attack. Bursting back inside, she found Avery with Deputy Morrison at a corner table, discussing the volunteer patrol schedules. "They're coming," she said, voice urgent, handing Avery the phone. He read the text, his expression hardening. "How do we respond?" Deputy Morrison asked, eyes wide. Avery exchanged a look with Victoria. "We gather the patrols, set up blockades at the main roads. If they're bold enough to say they're coming tonight, they'll probably use vehicles. We can funnel them into one route, hopefully." Victoria nodded. "There's the main highway exit and 2 back roads. We can block one with a truck or heavy equipment. The other, we can set up an ambush, force them onto the main strip where we'll be waiting." Avery rubbed his temples. "We'll have to coordinate quickly. Let's contact the volunteer groups. Warn them to gear up." "You sure about forcing a direct confrontation?" Victoria looked around, seeing the determination on the faces of those who remained. "They're going to strike us no matter what. Better we choose the battlefield and wait for them to burn another building or ambush a family." He exhaled, then nodded. "All right, let's do it. Kate, round up whoever's on patrol duty. I'll radio Tim to get the big snow plow from the maintenance yard to block the east road. Victoria, you handle the west road. Use trucks or logs, whatever you find." She saluted with 2 fingers, adrenaline surging. On it. Within half an hour, the entire volunteer force was in motion. Pickup trucks roamed the outskirts, depositing barricades at strategic points. Overturned garbage dumpsters, old tractor tires, anything to slow the enemy's vehicles. The plan was straightforward: funnel the cartel into the main strip, where the townspeople will be waiting behind cover. They had pre-selected vantage points, shop rooftops, parked trucks for cover, doorways with clear lines of fire. Night fell fully, cloaking Riverstone in darkness. Streetlights offered dim pools of illumination. Residents who were part of the armed defense hunkered down in locked houses, lights off. Some families took shelter in the old church basement, praying silently. The tension felt electric. Victoria, armed with her rifle and wearing a bulletproof vest beneath her jacket, took a position behind the partially ruined feed store. The alpha wolf crouched beside her, eyes reflecting the faint glow of streetlights. If the cartel came through the center of town, she'd have a vantage to flank them. A newly formed volunteer unit, 6 men with rifles and shotguns, was spread along storefronts. Colton had taken a high position on the roof of the diner across the street, scanning the road with binoculars. Time dragged. Minutes stretched into hours. Midnight approached. The only sounds were the wind rattling loose signs and the occasional nervous cough from a volunteer. Several times, they heard the distant howl of wind or the rumble of engines on the highway, but no cartel convoy materialized. Victoria began to suspect the message was a bluff to keep them on edge, or perhaps an attempt to lure them into a trap. She flicked on her radio, whispering to Avery, "Anything at your inn?" His voice crackled back. "Quiet. You?" "Same. Hold tight. We'll give it another hour or two." She exhaled, scanning the darkness. Despite the chill, sweat beaded on her forehead from the tension. The wolves stayed close, occasionally lifting their heads to sniff the air. The hours ticked on. By 2 a.m., some volunteers were nodding off, struggling against fatigue. Avery gave the order to rotate out a few watchers, letting fresh volunteers take over. Victoria refused to leave her post, though. She had a bad feeling. Around 3:15 a.m., a volunteer on the far side of town radioed in. His voice trembled with alarm. "Sheriff, I see lights, maybe 3 or 4 vehicles, no headlights, moving slow from the west road." "Over." Avery responded briskly. "They made it through the blockade?" "No, they must have found an alternate path, maybe that old logging trail." "Over." Avery cursed. "All units, be advised, enemy approaching from the west." "Victoria, that's near your location. They'll be on you fast." Victoria's heart hammered. "Copy," she whispered into the radio. "Everyone stay calm, pick your targets carefully." She alerted her small group of volunteers. They spread out, rifles trained on the western approach. The alpha wolf bared its teeth, a low growl rumbling in its throat. Moments later, engines roared to life in the darkness. The faint glow of headlights now switched on, revealing 3 SUVs racing into town. Gunfire erupted from their windows as they advanced, bullets ricocheting off asphalt and storefront walls. Shouts rang out. Victoria pressed herself against the feed store's facade, returning fire. Glass shattered as her bullets struck one SUV's windshield, forcing it to swerve. A volley of shots came from the diner's roof, Colton and a couple of others, firing down at the vehicles. One volunteer landed a direct hit on an SUV's tire, causing the vehicle to spin out and crash into a lamppost. Sparks flew. Its doors burst open, cartel men scrambling out, weapons blazing. One volunteer took a hit, collapsing behind a truck. Others ducked for cover, returning fire. The second and third SUVs advanced further into the main street, men at passenger seats leaning out and spraying bullets. Shop windows exploded in showers of glass. Fire hydrants spat water into the cold air when stray rounds struck them. The wolves bounded between cover, snarling and snapping at any thug who set foot on the sidewalk. One wolf clamped onto a man's leg, dragging him to the ground. He screamed, unloading shots wildly into the air, until a volunteer disarmed him. Victoria fired carefully, picking off a gunman who was crouched behind the SUV door. She saw the alpha wolf leap onto the hood of another vehicle, baring its teeth at the driver. The driver panicked, reversing into a parked truck, metal scraping in a shriek. The volunteer behind that truck dove aside just in time. Amid the chaos, Victoria caught sight of Godoy stepping out of the third SUV, shouting orders in Spanish. He wore body armor beneath a heavy coat and brandished an assault rifle. His eyes flicked with furious determination as he unloaded rounds at the diner's roof. Colton returned fire, forcing him to retreat behind the engine block. A thunderous boom echoed. Someone had used a shotgun at close range. Smoke drifted across the street, obscuring vision. The swirling water from the broken hydrants froze on the pavement, creating slick patches. Through the haze, Victoria advanced, using the feed store's walls for cover. She flanked the first SUV, where 2 cartel men were pinned down by volunteer fire. She squeezed the trigger, putting one down. The other retreated, only to meet the snapping jaws of the alpha wolf. Shouts in Spanish reverberated. The second SUV's men tried a different tactic, tossing homemade explosives into the street to flush out defenders. One small device exploded near the diner's door, sending splinters flying. Another volunteer screamed, clutching a leg wound. The third SUV was effectively out of commission, shot up and leaking fluid. Godoy barked curses, evidently realizing they'd walked into a well-prepared defense. Bullets zipped past Victoria. She dropped low, reloaded, then fired again, taking advantage of her position. She aimed for Godoy, but he moved with surprising agility. A bullet grazed his shoulder, but he barely faltered, returning fire wildly. She pressed herself against the building, feeling her pulse in her ears, breath ragged. The wolves wove through the pandemonium, uncanny in their silent coordination. One pounced a gunman who tried to flank the volunteers, ending his threat with a savage bite. The Alpha charged another group, bearing fangs that glinted with menacing fury. The outmatched cartel men retreated into whatever cover they could find. Wrecked vehicles, doorways. Suddenly, the second SUV roared forward, attempts to flee. A volunteer with a rifle blasted the driver through the windshield. The SUV fishtailed, crashing into a parked sedan, flipping onto its side. Screams came from inside as the occupants scrambled to escape. The alpha wolf wasted no time, pouncing onto the side door. Another volley of shots rang out. Sparks flew off the metal frame. Victoria flinched, worried for the wolf's safety, but the alpha nimbly jumped away, letting volunteers handle the gunman who emerged. Godoy, meanwhile, had retreated behind a small cluster of ornamental shrubs near a bank, reloading his rifle. Victoria spotted him through a gap in the swirling smoke. Sensing an opportunity, she advanced, crouched low, rifle raised. Through her scope, she glimpsed the fury on his face. He spat curses in Spanish, scanning for a target. She lined him up, finger on the trigger. A figure darted across her line of sight, a wounded volunteer stumbling for cover. She couldn't fire without risking friendly fire. She hesitated. In that moment, Godoy saw her. He raised his rifle, muzzle flashing in her direction. Bullets whizzed by, splintering the wooden wall behind her. She ducked, cursing. The moment was lost. The gunfight continued in a relentless symphony of chaos. Shouts, snarls, gunfire, screeching metal. The volunteer force had momentum, but the cartel fought with desperation. They had come to kill or be killed, and surrender wasn't an option in their code. Body armor on some of them provided partial protection, but the defenders' numbers and strategic positions turned the tide. By the time dawn's faint glow touched the horizon, the battle had largely ended. A few remaining cartel members either lay wounded or had been taken captive. Others fled into the snowy outskirts, though volunteer patrols were already sweeping the roads to capture stragglers. Victoria stood in the street, chest heaving, rifle still in her hands. Her eyes swept the carnage, bullet-ridden vehicles, shattered windows, bodies, some cartel, some volunteer. Her gut twisted at the sight of a rancher lying still on the pavement, a friend who had come to her training sessions the day before. The wolves trudged through the wreckage, muzzle first stained with gore, side heaving with exhaustion. In the distance, sirens wailed as the sheriff's department and paramedics scrambled to assist the wounded. A battered Godoy was nowhere in sight. She suspected he had slipped away in the chaos. Avery approached, holding a hand to a bleeding cut on his forehead. "We've got wounded." "Some dead," he reported, voice cracking with grief and fatigue. "But we held." "We held, Victoria." She nodded, tears threatening to sting her eyes, though she fought them back. "Is it over?" "For now," Avery replied, scanning the burning wreckage. "We might have gotten most of them, but Godoy's still out there." Soot, smoke, and blood tinged the cold dawn air. The townspeople, battered yet unbroken, gathered around. Some wept over fallen friends. Others limped or clutched bleeding arms. But they were alive, still standing. Riverstone had fought back. Would Godoy's narrow escape lead him to seek vengeance on Victoria personally, or would the battered cartel retreat for good, leaving Riverstone to mourn and rebuild? In the days that followed the battle on Riverstone's main street, the town struggled to regain its footing. The adrenaline rush of victory had faded, replaced by the somber realization of what had been lost. 3 townspeople had died in the firefight, and several more were seriously wounded. The small clinic worked overtime, aided by volunteers who possessed any medical training. Victoria herself spent hours helping with mundane but vital tasks, stocking supplies, comforting grieving families, and cleaning up debris. Meanwhile, law enforcement from surrounding counties finally rolled in to assist, now that the crisis had escalated to a near-catastrophic event. State troopers, detectives from Billings, even a handful of federal agents arrived to sift through the wreckage and gather evidence. They found multiple cartel weapons, ballistic vests, and vehicles riddled with bullets. Several wounded cartel members were taken into custody at the local hospital under heavy guard. Yet the one face that mattered most, Godoy, remained elusive. Rumors abounded. Some claimed he died and been quietly carried off by his men. Others insisted he slipped away into the mountains, waiting for a chance to strike again. The tension in town still simmered, everyone glancing over their shoulders, uncertain if another ambush might erupt. Sheriff Avery stationed deputies and roving patrols, backed by state troopers. The newly minted volunteer defense units maintained guard at key points, but many ranchers had to return to their land to care for animals and salvage their livelihoods. The feed store fire had left a major gap in resources, and folks were scrambling to coordinate feed shipments from neighboring towns. Amid this chaos, Victoria felt a looming sense of unfinished business. The wolf dogs, ever alert, seemed on edge, as if sensing that a predator was still lurking. She couldn't rest easily until she knew for sure that the cartel's threat was gone. One frosty morning, about 5 days after the battle, she received a call from Agent Darren Cole, the DEA contact who had initially brushed her off. He was in Riverstone now, setting up a temporary base in a commandeered office above the local hardware store. He asked her to come by. She arrived in her pickup, the wolves left behind at Scott's house, where they guarded the front porch. Entering the makeshift federal office, she found Cole, a tall, wiry man in his 40s, wearing a crisp suit that seemed out of place in a frontier town. He gestured for her to sit at a folding table, cluttered with papers and laptops. "Ms. Sullivan," he said, leaning forward, "I've reviewed the reports. The bravery shown by you and the townspeople is remarkable. And now we need your help identifying stragglers from the Los Águilas group." She crossed her arms, eyeing the photos arrayed on the table. Mugshots of captured cartel men, snapshots from the battle, intelligence charts. "I'll help however I can. But we still need to find Godoy." Cole nodded gravely. "We believe he's somewhere in these mountains. We've set up roadblocks on all major highways. If he tries to flee south, we'll catch him. If he tries crossing into Canada, we have alerts out. Our best guess is that he's holed up in a remote location with a couple of loyal henchmen." She scanned a topographical map pinned to the wall. The region was full of isolated cabins, logging roads, and old mining sites. Plenty of places for a fugitive to hide. A memory flickered, the old logging road near Silver Pine Ranch. Could he be there, plotting a final act of vengeance? Cole sighed. "Look, we don't have enough manpower to comb every inch of these mountains. But we do know he's after Miguel and you. The question is, will he risk another assault now that federal agents are here, or is he desperate enough to try?" Victoria's stomach churned. He's not exactly rational. He might want revenge for the humiliation in town. Cole rubbed his temples. "We're working on getting Miguel into witness protection. But there's red tape. Might be another week. In the meantime, we're checking every lead." She tapped her foot on the floor, a plan forming. "What if we flush him out? Make him think he can catch Miguel in a vulnerable spot, but we set a trap." Cole raised a brow. "A sting operation? Normally I'd be cautious, but under the circumstances, it might be our best shot. We'll need your help. You know the terrain, you know how Godoy thinks." She nodded. "He's prideful, hates losing. If he sees a chance to strike me or Miguel when we're supposedly exposed, he might take the bait." The details took shape quickly. Miguel, under guard, will be moved along a back road near the ranch, rumored to be heading south for relocation. Word would be leaked that the official route was blocked, so he had to pass through Silver Pine territory. In reality, a DEA tactical unit and local volunteers would lie in wait, hoping Godoy would leap at the opportunity. That evening, in an unused classroom of the old high school, Victoria and the federal agents hashed out the logistics. Sheriff Avery was there, as were Colton and a few other skilled volunteers. They studied maps under harsh fluorescent lights, marking vantage points. The next day, they put the plan in motion, hoping to bring the standoff to a decisive end. When they were done, Avery pulled Victoria aside. "You sure about this? You'll be the lure, basically." She met his eyes steadily. "If it ends this threat once and for all, I'm in." Early the next morning, the operation kicked off. Miguel was driven in an unmarked SUV along a winding back road near the ranch. A rumor circulated, intentionally leaked to a known cartel sympathizer who'd been caught but promised leniency in exchange for cooperation, that the route was lightly guarded. In truth, agents and volunteers hid behind snowbanks, logs, and rock outcroppings. Victoria was positioned with the Alpha Wolf near a bend in the road, out of sight but within rifle range. Hours passed in tense silence. The day was overcast, with occasional flurries drifting down. The only sound was the crunch of boots and the distant call of crows. Miguel sat in the SUV, flanked by two DA agents disguised as regular drivers, guns hidden. If Godoy was watching, the stage was set. Around midday, radio static crackled in Victoria's ear. "Possible movement to the north," whispered a volunteer scout. "Saw two figures on foot, heading toward the ridge. Could be them." Over. Her heart pounded. On foot? Maybe they abandoned vehicles to avoid roadblocks. She adjusted her scope, scanning the ridge. Through the gloom of snow-covered evergreens, she spotted a flicker of movement, two men slipping between the trees. One carried a rifle. The other's face came into view through the magnification. "Carlos Godoy. He's here." Victoria whispered into her mic. "He's got one man with him. Possibly more in the area." Radio replies came in hushed. The team braced, weapons trained. The SUV with Miguel remained parked near a bend, engine idling as though waiting for something. Inside, the disguised agents tensed, hands on concealed pistols. Minutes stretched. Godoy and his companion moved closer, using the trees as cover, apparently scoping the situation. Godoy raised binoculars. Victoria's stomach tightened. If he recognized the setup, he might vanish again. She signaled for the SUV to start rolling forward, mimicking a cautious approach. The agent behind the wheel obeyed, creeping along the snowy track. Sure enough, Godoy seized the opening. He and his companion darted down the slope, rifles at the ready. The plan was for them to ambush the SUV in a choke point, but they never got the chance. As soon as they emerged from the tree lean, a volley of warning shots erupted from the DA agents on the hillside. "Freeze! Drop your weapons!" crackled through loudspeakers. In response, Godoy and his partner dove behind a fallen log, returning fire. Bullets zipped through the trees. The Alpha Wolf beside Victoria snarled, hackles rising. She sighted in on Godoy's companion, fired once, and saw him collapse with a scream, clutching his leg. Godoy cursed in Spanish, lobbing a grenade-like device that smoked heavily, obscuring the line of sight. Chaos ensued. Agents repositioned. Volunteers tried to circle around. The smoke parted intermittently, revealing Godoy bounding from tree to tree. He knew the area well enough to maneuver. Victoria advanced, rifle up, scanning the swirling haze. She caught a glimpse of him reloading. She fired, but he was gone in a flash of movement. Gunshots echoed, biting into the trunks of pines, sending bark flying. The Alpha Wolf darted ahead, ignoring the smoke. Victoria followed, trusting the animal's instincts. Heart pounding, she paused behind a rock outcropping, searching for Godoy. A shout from an agent up the slope. "He's flanking left." Victoria pivoted, rushing through the snow. Sure enough, Godoy emerged from the billowing smoke on her left, rifle raised. Their eyes met, raw hatred twisting his features. He fired. She dove, feeling a bullet crack the air near her head. She rolled behind a fallen tree. He advanced, stepping carefully over branches, scanning for her. She could smell his cologne mixed with sweat and smoke. This was his last stand. She sensed it in his feverish eyes, the snarl on his lips. The alpha wolf lunged from a blind angle, teeth aiming for his throat. He yelped a curse, swinging his rifle around. A shot rang out, grazing the wolf's shoulder. The alpha snarled, snapping at him. Godoy bashed the animal with the rifle, but sending it sprawling into the snow. Rage flared in Victoria's chest. She rose, gun leveled. Godoy spun, muzzle flashing. Time slowed. She felt the searing pain of a bullet grazing her left side, but she fired a split second later. Her round struck him low in the torso. He gasped, staggering. Still, he tried to lift his weapon again, eyes wild with desperation. She squeezed the trigger once more, placing a second bullet center mass. Godoy collapsed backward, rifle clattering to the ground. Blood stained the snow under him. For a moment, his eyes locked onto hers, a mixture of disbelief and hate flickering across his face. Then he exhaled sharply, the light leaving his gaze. The forest stilled. Smoke drifted around them. Victoria took a shaky breath, pressing a hand to her side where she'd been grazed. It was a shallow wound, but it burned fiercely. She dropped to one knee next to the alpha wolf, gently running a hand over its flank. The bullet wound was bleeding, but not profusely. She murmured soothing words, relief flooding her. Agents and volunteers rushed in, guns drawn, checking for any additional threats. They found only Godoy's fallen partner, wounded but alive, cursing in Spanish. An agent cuffed him while paramedics were called. Another group converged on Godoy's body, confirming no pulse. "It's over," one of them said, looking from Victoria to the wolf. "You got him." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, wincing at the pain in her side. "It's over." News spread fast across Riverstone. Godoy was dead, and the cartel's leadership in the region had collapsed. The battered survivors who hadn't been captured were fleeing the area. The state and federal agencies swept in to pick up the pieces, offering the town some semblance of closure. Miguel, safe from retribution, cooperated with authorities and provided details that led to more arrests. Soon, he'd be relocated under a federal witness program, free to start anew. He personally thanked Victoria before he left, tears of gratitude in his eyes. The townspeople began the slow process of rebuilding. The feed store was gone, but neighbors pitched in to construct a temporary depot for livestock supplies. The scars of bullet holes and shattered windows remained along Main Street, silent testament to the fierce fight that had taken place. And in the hearts of many, the loss of 3 neighbors weighed heavily. As for Victoria, she returned to Silver Pine Ranch with her wolf dogs, determined to find peace at last. She mended fences, cleared debris, and slowly brought the horses back from their hidden corral. Life resumed. The alpha wolf's wounds healed under her tender care, though he walked with a slight limp that would forever remind them of the final battle. Victoria herself bore a healing bullet crease on her left side, a scar she would carry with pride and sorrow. On a crisp spring morning, some weeks after the town's darkest night, Victoria stood at the ranch's edge, watching a new sunrise crest over the mountains. The air carried the scent of pine and fresh grass, the horse pastures vibrant under the returning warmth. Her 3 wolves flanked her, eyes keen on the horizon. The alpha, scarred muzzle lifted, closed his eyes and let out a soft, contented huff. She thought of the townspeople, how they had come together, forging an unbreakable bond through hardship. She thought of the friends lost, the families grieving. She thought of the raw courage she'd witnessed in the face of brutality. And she thought of Godoy, how a single bullet had ended his reign of terror, but not before leaving an indelible mark on this quiet stretch of Montana. Yet here she stood unbroken, with the land still hers and her beloved animals safe. The morning sun bathed her in golden light, and for a moment she closed her eyes, letting the warmth touch the bruises on her soul. She recalled the lessons she'd learned in life, that evil could appear anywhere, that communities could unite against even the darkest threats, and that sometimes the only way to protect what you love was to fight for it. The alpha wolf nudged her hand, a gentle prompt to head back for breakfast. She smiled and ran her fingers through his thick fur. "Let's go," she whispered. Together, woman and wolves turned from the boundary fence, walking side by side toward the ranch house, ready at last for whatever new day might bring.